Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. And also, a very happy New Year's Eve to all you lovely ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ross, voice for radio, and you know what? It's New Year's Eve, and I figured we need to start a new tradition this year. So from now on, every New Year's Eve, I'm going to bring you the year in review of the Pokemon trading card game. That sounds like fun to me, ladies and gentlemen. That sounds like fun. So what we're going to do is run through all the biggest stories. We're going to run through everything that happened in the year of 2019. And oh my goodness, it was a busy year. Now, if we start off looking at the sets that were released, there were, as there are every year, 4 main sets released in the Pokemon trading card game. We started off in February with the release of Team Up, and Team Up was a very important set. Team Up was the expansion that brought us Tag Team Pokemon. Chief among them, for that particular set at least, Pikachu and Zekrom Tag Team GX. Now, there were a bunch, of course. And we even got Magikarp and Wailord, which broke the record at the time for highest HP for any Pokemon card ever, with a gigantic 300 HP. But it really was the emergence of Tag Team Pokemon that was so big. Now, it's not the only thing the set did, of course. It introduced us to Zapdos, a very nice attacker, and Jirachi, who has become one of the very, very best Pokemon that we've had ever, pretty much. And it was an all-round nice set for Lightning Pokemon because it brought us Tapu Koko Prism Star. As a side note, we are going to have to go at a fair clip through some of these stories, so if I'm not mentioning every single card you wish I did, that, ladies and gentlemen, is what the comment section is there for. Fast forward to May, and we saw Unbroken Bonds come around. Now, there was no real great hook in Unbroken Bonds. There was nothing really we saw in Unbroken Bonds that we hadn't seen before. Except, of course, that it saw the return of baby Pokemon. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Baby Pokemon came back to the Pokemon trading card game in Unbroken Bonds with stuff like Cleffa. So Cleffa, for instance, and all the baby Pokemon have the exact same hook, right? What they do is they've got an ability that ends your turn, and you flip a coin. If heads, you get to do something. Cleffa, for instance, lets you shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 6 cards. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing, and they've not seen a huge amount of play, etc., 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 right? Let's not worry too much about that. The main thing is, baby Pokemon came back, and that was lovely. Really, the big headline that we saw in Unbroken Bonds was Fire Pokemon. We saw Reshiram and Charizard, which has been vying for best Pokemon in the set since it came out. And it introduced us to cards like Welder, that lets you attach 2 fire energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon, and then draw 3 cards. It's a phenomenal card that completely shook up the format. Of course, we also got stuff like Fire Crystal to get fire energy specifically, back from our discard pile, and Giant Half to search it out from our deck. It was very much a set for fire Pokemon, and Reshiram and Charizard was the big story coming out. Now, moving forward into Unified Minds, there really wasn't anything particularly special about Unified Minds. There was no new mechanic, no new type of card that we saw here. It was very much a, carrying on kind of set. Now, that is not in any way, shape, or form to say it was a bad set. It brought us Mewtwo and Mew, which has, again, for the 3rd set in a row, we've gotten ourselves a Tag Team Pokemon, which has really come in to try and reinvent and break the format. Although, to be fair, there was one new thing we saw in Unified Minds, and it was a little bit of a weird one. Z-moves. Yeah, we got Normalium Z and Flyinium Z, and it was a way that Z-moves are actually brought into the Pokemon trading card game. And we didn't get many of them, and they've not really seen any play, but what they did was they gave Pokemon that had a certain move the ability to use a Z move. So Normalium Z, for instance, was a tool which could be attached to anyone. Tools can always be attached to anyone. But what Normalium Z did was, if the Pokemon had the attack tackle, it let them use Barreling Blitz, 200 damage for 4 colourless energy, flip a coin until you get tails, 40 more for each heads. Not really the biggest story in the Pokemon trading card game in the past year, but I suppose that is the one thing that Unified Minds has that other sets just didn't. And then finally, in November, we finally got the release of Cosmic Eclipse, which is the very last of the Sun and Moon expansions. This is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is the end of the Sun and Moon expansion, ready for Sword and Shield, which is going to be coming along in February, starting a new block, as it were. And this set, it brought us Arceus and Dialga and Palkia. That was the best card that we got in the set. It lets you, it's got a GX attack, right? That means you do an extra 30 damage for all of your attacks, while also taking an extra prize every time you take a KO, which is, a little bit over the top dumb good, I think is fair to say. But this also introduced us to the concept of tag team supporters. So one of the most popular of these is Cynthia and Caitlyn. When you play it, you get to grab a supporter card from your discard pile, put it into your hand, that's fine. But you then had the chance to discard another card from your hand and draw 3 cards. And that was the real hook of tag team supporters. You do something, but if you discard cards from your hand, you get to do something else. Red and Blue lets you search for a GX that evolves in one of your Pokemon and evolve it up. But if you discard 2 cards from your hand, you get to search for 2 basic energy and just attach them straight away. This was the new thing that we really saw in Cosmic Eclipse. Though it is also worth noting that we did get some weird artwork, full art cards which had trainers on. So if we look at my boy Excadrill, for instance, there was the regular Excadrill, which is lovely, but then there was a full art Excadrill that had clay in the artwork as well, which was very cool. Also worth noting, the Cosmic Eclipse had 271 cards in, which is frankly absolutely ridiculous. Now those are the main sets that we got, but we did also get a couple of mini sets as well. When I say mini set, I'm referring to sets other than the ones that come along every 3 months. Now the real true mini set we got was Detective Pikachu. This was a very small set which came around to mark the release of the Detective Pikachu movie, and obviously this came around in March along with the movie. Not a particularly good or playable set. It is very much relevant because, and interesting, it uses the artwork from the movie. The only really good card in the set which has seen a lot of play is Eager Ninja GX, whose ability lets you play it from your hand even though it's a stage 2, just ordinarily, if it's the only card in your hand, and then you draw 3 cards. But also for 2 energy, it goes through weakness, resistance, and any other effects on the defending Pokemon, so it's been a nice answer against Pokemon like Alolan Ninetales that would otherwise block a bunch of stuff in your deck. It's found its way into Mewtwo and Mew decks. A very, very cool set, don't get me wrong, but certainly not a great set with a huge amount of great cards in. The more interesting set for most people was Hidden Fates, which came around in August. And Hidden Fates really was a set of 2 halves. You had the ordinary set, which was, largely underwhelming from a competitive standpoint. So there were a bunch of reprints in there. For instance, you had a Pokemon Center Lady reprint, which is all well and good. But then you did have a few new cards. Now, this actually did include Charizard GX, which was actually a very, very good card, because for 4 energy, it could do 300 damage as a GX attack. And long story short, this was played in Mewtwo and Mew decks with Welder for a very quick, going first, turn 2, 300 damage. It was a very useful, very successful card. The rest of the set hasn't fared as well. But then you had the other part of the set, which was the Shiny Vault, which had a whole bunch of very shiny, very nice cards, including, let's not bury the lead here, Shiny Charizard. Shiny Charizard is a great card, an extremely expensive card, and it has become the most sought after card in the Pokemon trading card game. Certainly in terms of cards that you can just pull normally from booster packs, this has become the number one, like the genuine, actual number one card that people want to pull most often. And I did pull one, and I was delighted. Now, as with every year, we did have a rotation, although this did change a little bit this year. We rotated to Ultra Prism On before the World Championships. Now, this doesn't usually happen. Generally speaking, our rotation happens on September the 1st, shortly after the conclusion of the World Championships, but we mixed it around this year. We had our rotation to Ultra Prism On before World, and this really shook up the format. It took away cards like Tapu Lele that we'd all been using as a consistency crutch, but it also got rid of cards like Ultra Ball and Nest Ball, meaning that especially non-GX decks really struggled in terms of being able to just search Pokemon and set up. It took away Guzma without any really good alternative for Gusting, which left us all playing Custom Catcher, because it was literally the best option that we got. It took away Field Blower, meaning we don't really have any good way of getting rid of tools, and it got rid of Rescue Stretcher, which was the only really good item card we had for recovering our Pokemon. It really shook up the format. It also got rid of Zoroark GX, that had been, and we're going to see in a minute, we're going to go through the biggest tournaments of the year, but Zoroark GX, fair to say, shook up the format the entire time it was here, and we finally got rid of it and stopped its winning streak. But it wasn't just rotation that happened this year. You see, we had a bunch of banned cards as well, though I should mention, as with all the bans, only in the expanded format. With one exception, we actually saw Blaine's Quiz Show banned at the World Championships for a super weird reason. Now, Blaine's Quiz Show says that you need to put a Pokemon from your hand face down in front of you, you give your opponent an attack name, and your opponent needs to guess the name of the Pokemon. But especially with European languages, sometimes the same attack has different names or different attacks have the same name. It was too confusing from a translation point of view, so just for the Pokemon World Championships, it was banned. As a side note, I've done videos about a whole bunch of stuff featured in this video, like Blaine's being banned for Worlds. I'll pop a whole bunch of links in the description, so if you want to know more about any of these sets or more about any of the bans or any of that stuff, I'll pop a whole bunch of links in the description so you can go as deep down the rabbit hole as you like. Now, the ban started very early on this year. Back in January, we banned Maxie's Hidden Ball Trick and Unknown Damage. Now again, I'm going to have to be extremely quick about this, but Maxie's Hidden Ball Trick allowed us to get Pokemon like Archeops, although that had been the case for a while. But then we added in stuff like Omastar and Kabutops, and there were just too many super disruptive cards that could be dropped super early using Maxis, so we had to ban it. Unknown Damage, on the other hand, you got to win if you had a certain amount of damage on the board, and there were these really weird combos using stuff like Blastoise to attach loads of energy, with Frozen City in play, and then using Energy Reset to pick up the energy and do it all over again, that could potentially lead to, turn one combos just winning the game. So Unknown Damage got banned, and Unknown Damage had to go. We saw Delinquent get banned. Delinquent just let you discard cards from your opponent's hand. It let you discard a stadium card in play, and then your opponent had to discard 3 cards from their hand. But you would try and drop this when they only had 3 cards in hand, or maybe even fewer, and it would just absolutely wreck any plans that they had. And this was really the start of the assault on hand disruption cards that only went on as we got further into the year. Lusamine went and got banned. It let you recover supporter cards and stadiums, but it basically let you infinitely loop cards like Team Flare Grunt. Because you could only play 4 supporters in your deck of the same kind, there was always a limit to what you could do. But Lusamine allowing you to just get them all back ended up just creating this loop that was too much, and we had to get rid of it. Fast forward to just 4 months ago, and we had a couple of other cards banned. We had Unknown Hand and Reset Stamp. Now, Reset Stamp made very little sense at the time, but I'll tell you about the other set of bans in a minute, and then it will make more sense. Sorry, as a side note, these cards got banned in Japan, and the Reset Stamp didn't make sense, but it made sense later. Unknown Hand, on the other hand, it's just exactly like we saw with Unknown Damage. It's got an alternate win condition, this being you've got X number of cards in your hand, and in the expanded format, there were just too many dumb combos that could be abused. Like, for instance, using the Magnezone that let you play 2 supporters in 1 turn, so that you could use Whitney to draw 7 cards over and over again, using Versus Seeker to reuse it, while you sat there using Sableye to make sure that your opponent couldn't play any supporters. Dumb combos like that were always going to happen with Unknown. As a side note, Unknown Supporter has so far, or Unknown Missing, it has escaped being banned, but I'm sure at some point a combo will come along which leads to it being banned. Now, Jesse and James was an odd one, because Jesse and James actually got banned before it ever even got released. Each player discards 2 cards from their hand, your opponent discards first. But that could be combined with the Wheezing from Hidden Fates, whereby if that was discarded, your opponent had to discard another card from their hand. And again, we had a war this year on hand disruption. Agree with it, disagree with it. This was a year where this happened. And Jesse and James was a big part of it. Now, we then had a big whole bunch of cards being banned. And these included Red Card, which could put your opponent down to a small hand size. Chip Chip Ice Axe that let you rearrange the top cards of your opponent's deck so they drew badly after they had a 0-card hand. Lieutenant Surge's Strategy to let you play 2 supporters at once. So essentially what you would do was end your opponent down to a 1-card hand and then play Mars so that they then had a 0-card hand. That would be a very bad thing indeed. Reset Stamp, which again, if your opponent had 1 prize remaining, this could put them down to a 0-card hand, ready for Mars. Except in Japan, that had already been banned a little while before. And Island Challenge Amulet, which just led to a silly broken combo. So the general theory was you would use Island Challenge Amulet to attach to Jirachi. That would then reduce Jirachi's HP by 100, which would instantly KO it. You give your opponent 2 prizes, you do that twice, use Miss Magius to give them a 5th prize, they've now got a 1-card hand, so you use something like N and Mars to give them a 0-card hand, and then Chip Chip Ice Axe so they drew into nothing. It was the ultimate hand disruption deck, and it got banned because it literally broke the game. So with all of that done, let's talk about the tournaments we saw this year, and what actually happened. Now, we're only going to focus on the biggest tournaments, and we're going to look at standard tournaments, expanded tournaments, and Japanese tournaments. And we're going to go chronologically. So starting off in January, we actually had a huge expanded regional in Dallas, where 802 people turned up, and it was won by Dean Nizam, apologies for any pronunciations here, who was playing Zoroark with Golisopod. I told you Zoroark was rocking all year. But we also saw big turnouts from Zoroark Garbodor and Archie's Blastoise decks. Again, we're running through these tournaments showing the general trends. There are some decks we're not going to mention. We're focusing on the format as a whole throughout the year. In February, we had our first of 4 international championships for the year. Over in Oceania, 338 people turned up, and Byron Isaiah Williams won it with a Zapdos Jirachi deck. Though we did see a lot of Pikachu and Zekrom, Zoroark Lycanroc was an extremely good deck, and it was until it rotated out. And Malamar Ultra Necrozma was very well represented. Malamar to accelerate energy, Ultra Necrozma to smash. Still in February, Japan had their biggest tournament so far, first big one of the year, the Champions League in Chiba, with 1,786 participants, which as far as I am aware was the largest Pokemon tournament of the year, won by Yu playing Quad, Buzzwole and Pheromosa. And there's a fun little quiz question for you. Which deck won the largest Pokemon tournament of 2019? I don't think many people that haven't watched this video would know it was Buzzwole and Pheromosa. But it was a very, very varied tournament. We saw good representation from Lucario and Melmetal. We saw that Vileplume deck that blocks basics coming out big, as you would expect in a format full of basic Pokemon. Gardevoir and Sylveon saw a lot of play and a lot of success in that particular tournament. Pikachu and Zekrom, shockingly. Mimikyu and Gengar, or Gengar and Mimikyu as it actually is, was out and doing quite well. And Malamar Ultra Necrozma again doing well in Japan as well. Moving forward into February, it's the only standard regional we're going to mention from the year because 1,056 people rocked up to Collinsville, making it the only regional this year that broke 1,000 players. And Zach Lesage took home the trophy with Blacephalon GX. I know, right? Although also using Naganadel to accelerate energy, so Blacephalon could Lost Zone it all and smash. Now, Pikachu and Zekrom, get used to hearing me say that, still did very, very well, as did Zoroark Lycanroc, as did Malamar Ultra Necrozma. Moving into March, we had another big expanded tournament, or big-ish. Expanded tournaments are generally a bit smaller. Over in Greensboro, North Carolina, 389 people rocked up, and Andrew Martin took home the trophy with Drampa Garbodor, the only time that deck is going to be mentioned in this video. Archie's Blastoise still big, Pikachu and Zekrom still big, Zoroark Garbodor still big. Zoroark Garbodor was one of the best decks in Expanded throughout the year. Moving into April, we had another large tournament in Japan. We had the Champions League Kyoto, 1,489 people rocked up. Japan Champions League have huge attendances. Ryoya Kanagawa rocked up and won it with Reshiram and Charizard. Yeah, that was legal now. Hooper decks had a very large showing here, however, coming to block people who were relying on GX decks. And we also saw Blacephalon doing very well, but make no mistake about it, in this tournament, Reshiram and Charizard absolutely dominated. Still in April, we had our second international championships in Europe, although they moved to Berlin this year after the first two happened in London. And 819 people rocked up, and Gustavo Wada won it with Pikarom. And this was the Pikarom tournament. Zoroark Lycanroc was a good deck that had a good representation, but it really was a Pikarom tournament. Skipping forward into June, we had it was our third internationals of the year, but our last one before Worlds. It was a North American internationals and the biggest non-Japanese tournament of the year. 1,122 players turned up, and Stefan Ivanov won with Zoroark Dugong. Interesting because Dugong, it took out evolving Pokemon on the bench. It was kind of hilarious. And it was the second year in a row that the Frenchman had rocked up and won the North American Internationals. It's the biggest tournament of the year outside of Japan. To have the same dude win it 2 years running is quite impressive. Big showings as well for Pikachu and Zekrom, shockingly, Reshiram and Charizard, and Blacephalon. But it is worth noting that this was a tournament where an awful lot of decks were represented. This was a very varied tournament. Moving forward to August, we saw the World Championships 2019. Only 118 people in Day 2, but it was difficult to get to Day 2. And Henry Brand won it with Mewtwo and Mew, bearing in mind this was the first tournament where Mewtwo and Mew was legal. Yeah, it turns out having a Pokemon that can copy the attacks of any EX or GX on your bench or in your discard pile was pretty gosh darn good. Reshiram and Charizard showed up, Gardevoir and Sylveon showed up, Blacephalon showed up, and we saw the emergence of Oranguru Pidgeotto hand control. Oranguru recovers cards, Pidgeotto draws cards, and you play everything under the sun from Crushing Hammer onwards to try and frustrate your opponent until they run out of cards and lose the game. My pick for worst deck of the year, or at least the most frustrating to play against. Moving into September, there was a Champions League in Tokyo with 1,600 people rocking up, and Daichi Shimada won the whole thing with Lucario and Melmetal. Not the deck we expected to take it home. Though it is worth pointing out, and I feel horrible saying this, Reshiram and Charizard was everywhere in that tournament, and if any of you watched the live stream, you'll have noticed that the Reshiram and Charizard player literally had game in hand in the final and threw it away. We could easily be talking about Reshiram and Charizard winning this tournament. Also worth noting that Mewtwo and Mew was everywhere. The final big expanded tournament of the year was in Portland in November. 458 people turned up, and Ian Robb won the whole thing with Zoroark Garbodor. Oranguru Control had a very good showing. Gardevoir and Sylveon had a very good showing, but worth pointing out that Aromatisse made a triumphant return here after not being relevant since Xerneas was good. It came back in Gardevoir and Sylveon decks at the end of this year. Mewtwo and Mew was very good, and Greninja and Zoroark finally had the tools to start coming out and doing rather well. And then the last big tournament of the year was at the Latin American Internationals, where 726 people rocked up, and Robin Schultz won it with Reshizard. Although again, that's slightly disingenuous, it was really more of a general welder deck. The deck only played one Reshiram and Charizard. Mewtwo and Mew was absolutely everywhere, and because Cosmic Eclipse was now legal, we saw Arceus and Dialga and Palkia, often with Keldeo GX, coming out as an absolute force. Didn't win, but certainly did show up. We saw non-GX Blacephalon of all things starting to really come out. It's a deck that ever since Unbroken Bonds came out did have a bit of a showing, but it was really at this tournament where it started to make some waves. And we saw Florges and Lily's Clefairy, which aims to just always have a zero prize Pokemon in the active, actually coming out and having a pretty good showing. Moving forward into next year, the one thing we can say for certain is, well, we've just had a giant Japanese tournament, right? And it was won by Pikachu and Zekrom. But also Zacian V is very much the deck to beat over in Japan right now. So moving into 2020, probably put those two decks at the top of your hit list or to play list, depending on whether you want to go with a crowd or swim against the stream. But that, ladies and gentlemen, was 2019 in the Pokemon trading card game. The sets that came out, the cards that were banned, the rotation that happened, and the big tournaments that came along. Far longer than my average video, but ladies and gentlemen, a lot happened this year. So yes, I probably didn't mention one or two cards you wanted me to. Yes, there were probably a couple of decks that you really enjoyed that did fairly well, that I didn't mention that you'd rather I did. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, a lot happened this year. But maybe you've got your own memories that you're just furious that I didn't share. Well, great news, ladies and gentlemen. There's a comment section, so go nuts, but be nice. And then make sure you like this video, subscribe, seriously, please like it. It took so long to make. Subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWasi, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts, all that good stuff, let me carry on doing what I'm doing, then head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. And please do make sure you're checking out youtube.com/WassiePlays, where we talk about games that aren't Pokemon, but are still awesome. And if you're wondering what happened in Keyforge and the Transformers trading card game this year, might want to pop over there. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.